Hello, and welcome to African Elements, where we're producing Africana Studies content and leaving it right here where the people are at. In this video, we'll look at the various, often conflicting elements of Black nationalism in the struggle for Black liberation and self-determination, and specifically at Maulana Karenga and his notion of cultural nationalism within US organization. Is conflict inevitable between Black nationalist organizations such as US and other civil rights organizations such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which operate outside the Black nationalist framework? Can there be unity in diversity? All that coming up next. Thank you for watching African Elements. Once again, I'd like to give a big thanks to our Patreon members. For as little as $1 a month, you too can support this content. Check out the link in the description below. Also, be sure to stick around to the end, where you can weigh in on our question of the day. In an earlier video, I discussed 6 overlapping characteristics of Black nationalism. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, the link is in the description below. Of the 6 overlapping characteristics of Black nationalism, cultural nationalism, religious nationalism, economic nationalism, political nationalism, and Pan-Africanism, Maulana Karenga and US organization, which will be the focus of this program, emphasized cultural nationalism. Founded by Maulana Karenga in 1965, the US organization and cultural nationalism emphasizes that people have a culture, style of life, and approach to the problems of existence that are distinct from white Americans in particular and Westerners in general. As such, cultural nationalists tend to place a heavy emphasis on African-centered education, religion, and culture. From a cultural nationalist perspective, this African-centered framework informs a Black historical perspective and highlights unique contributions to humanity. The definition of culture, as US organizations saw it, is a complete value system, as well as a means of maintaining that value system. Cultural nationalists tend to look at the adoption of European culture, everything from European languages, religious practices, holidays, customs, traditions, and even political and economic structure as counterproductive for persons of African descent. The problem of Western cultural imperialism, as Black cultural nationalists view it, is particularly apparent in the many problems facing the African continent that are largely rooted in colonialism and the fundamental transformation of the African continent as a legacy of European colonization. The Anglophone-Francophone crisis in Cameroon is just one example, but others include conflict minerals such as diamonds and cobalt, as well as the border crisis in South Africa, among many other nations. Cultural nationalists further believe that the problems visible on the African continent as a result of imperialism also manifest in persons of African descent throughout the world. The writings of Frantz Fanon are probably the best starting point for those who want to dive deeper into that topic. The psychological impact of colonization and the fundamental harm it's caused is evident most famously in the Dahl test, which was first conducted in the 1940s, but has since been repeated on a number of occasions, including in this clip here.
Which doll is the black doll? And which one is the white doll?
That one.
Which doll is the pretty doll? Which doll is the nice doll? Which doll is the bad doll? Which doll is the nice doll? And which doll is the bad doll? And why is that doll pretty?
Because he's white and he has 2 eyes.
Which doll is the ugly doll? Why is that doll ugly?
Because he's black.
Which doll looks most like you?
Like me.
Yeah, which one looks like you?
And that one.
Okay.
That doll.
So this is the reason that Black cultural nationalists such as Maulana Karenga promote an African-centered worldview as a remedy to the European-centered way of being, which Karenga and other black cultural nationalists see as a root cause for African and African American self-hatred and self-destructive behavior. Because as persons of African descent worldwide, the very language we use to express ourselves is often the very language of the colonizer, many cultural nationalists have sought to replace that language with one that's African-centered. It's for that reason that Kiswahili has a special appeal to black cultural nationalists. Swahili is a Pan-African language spoken by a broad range of ethnicities in regions throughout Eastern and Central Africa, as well as parts of Southern Africa. As Karenga stated in 1966, we don't know what tribe we came from, so we choose an African language that's non-tribal, which is widely spoken in Africa. At the Second Congress of African Writers, held in Rome in 1966, Kiswahili came to be seen as the optimum choice for a continent-wide adoption of a single African language. As a direct challenge to European notions of blackness, Karenga articulated his own principles of blackness, or Nguzo Saba. Those principles, umoja, unity, kujijagalia, self-determination, ujamaa, collective work and responsibility, ujamaa, cooperative economics, nia, purpose, kumba, creativity, and imani, faith, are each celebrated over the 7 days of Kwanzaa. US organization founder Maulana Karenga explains.
And so I created Kwanzaa for three basic reasons. First, to reaffirm our rootedness in African culture. Because even though we're African people, due to the Holocaust of enslavement, we were lifted out of our own history and made a footnote and forgotten casualty in European history. And so the struggle we were waging, as Cabral said, is to return to our history and to use it to enrich and expand our lives. Secondly, I have created Kwanzaa in order to give us a time when we as African people all over the world could come together, reaffirm the bonds between us, and meditate on the meaning and awesome responsibility of being African in the world. And certainly it has flowered because of that. Because if you look at how it has grown, over 28 million people celebrate this holiday on every continent in the world, throughout the world African community. And the third reason I created Kwanzaa was to introduce and reinforce the importance of African culture and African communitarian values. And by communitarian values, I mean values that stress and strengthen family, community, and culture. These are our strengths.
US organization, in further defining blackness, articulated the Kanuni, 21 rules and behavioral characteristics that define their particular brand of cultural nationalism. Among them, advocates shall refrain from unnecessary or loud talking or screaming, smoking, drinking, profanity, and horsefly. Refrain from disrespecting each other in terms of their roles as men and women, advocates, and officers. Refrain from playboyism and playgirlism, and refrain from using physical force against each other in the settlement of disputes. So here we see a few examples of how black cultural nationalists emphasize redefining what culture is for persons of African descent. It's important to understand that this redefining of culture is an effort to shape the way black people view themselves in the most fundamental way. As Karenga states, everything we do, think, or learn is somehow interpreted as cultural expression. That includes not only customs and behaviors, but as we've seen, it also includes language, religion, politics, and economics, and the reshaping of all those elements into an African-centered worldview. Black nationalist philosophy wasn't the only ideology in use in the Black liberation struggle. The ideology of nonviolent passive resistance, as practiced by Dr. Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and groups like the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE, represented a fundamentally different approach to the Black liberation struggle that was often in conflict with the US organization and other Black nationalist organizations, such as the Nation of Islam or the Black Panther Party. Likewise, socialist-oriented groups, as well as the Communist Party, offered alternative approaches to Black liberation that often clashed with Black nationalist organizations. While certain aspects of socialism would seem to be complementary to what US organization defined as the 7 principles of blackness, particularly the notion of ujamaa, a Kiswahili word that literally means familyhood, on the surface it would appear that the two ideologies could operate in tandem. In fact, the first Tanzanian head of state, Julius Nyerere, attempted to operationalize the idea of African socialism as state policy by naming his government's African socialist program Ujamaa. Socialism, or Ujamaa, is needed to ensure that the people care for each other's welfare, which is a core tenet of African-centered frame of thought. The problem, though, is that both socialism and communism are associated with the very European dogmas that African-centeredness sought to distance itself from. So a distinction had to be made between collectivism or communism, which represented the European model, whereas communalism was the term Karenga used for the African-centered model. To be communalistic, Karenga stated, is to share willingly, but to be collectivistic is to force to share, which is a European concept. Historically, the goals of the Communist Party and the Socialists were inherently in conflict with those of black nationalists like Marcus Garvey. Garvey rejected class unity in favor of racial unity. Class unity between blacks and poor whites would never work in Garvey's view because he viewed racial prejudice as congenital and that it could never be purged from whites. So the central inherent conflict between the two ideologies, communism and black nationalism, was one of class unity versus racial unity. While Marcus Garvey sought a Pan-African approach, a viewpoint which placed blacks in the United States in common cause with blacks throughout the world and on the continent of Africa, the communists sought to bring their international coalition, not confined by race or Pan-Africanism. Between black nationalism and civil rights, there's also a fundamental difference in worldview that's going to frame the ideological divide between folks like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, as well as other black nationalist organizations. The integrationist goals of the civil rights movement and the goals of separatism and self-determination forward by black nationalists mix together about as well as oil and water. The civil rights agenda that sought reform, social justice, political rights guaranteed by the Constitution and Bill of Rights were considered by black nationalists to be counterproductive, in that the nation's governing principles were simply instruments of government oppression of African Americans and other people of color. The different approaches between the various organizations often brought about open hostilities and sometimes manifested in the groups ruthlessly undermining each other. The NAACP, for example, cooperated with the FBI in the prosecution of Marcus Garvey that led to his exile from the United States. Thurgood Marshall would later cooperate with the FBI in undermining the Nation of Islam. Alex Haley, the author of Roots, was actually hired by the FBI when he was working as a journalist to help develop negative articles on the Nation of Islam. As we see in the following clip, even when groups such as the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee coalesced around the same issue, such as the March Against Fear, a 220-mile solidarity march from Memphis, Tennessee to Jackson, Mississippi to protest racism, often their ideological differences prevented them from working together effectively.
And I think it was more of a youth movement in all of the organizations asserting themselves far more than it was competition among leaders themselves. It was a clash of ideas, no question about a clash of ideas.
If we're going to be free, we will have to suffer for that freedom. We will have to sacrifice for it.
That I'm not going to beg the white man for anything that I deserve. I'm going to take it.
Let me say first that this march is nonviolent. It is a nonviolent expression of our determination to be free. This is the principle of the march, and certainly we intend to keep this march nonviolent.
Mr. Carmichael, are you as committed to the nonviolent approach as Dr. King is?
No, I'm not.
Why aren't you?
Well, I just don't see it as a way of life. I never have. I also realize that no one in this country is asking the white community in the South to be nonviolent. And that, in a sense, is giving them a free license to go ahead and shoot us at will.
So as we can see, unity between cultural black nationalist organizations and integrationist organizations, as well as communist and socialist organizations, is a difficult task. How might it be achieved? How might these different organizations, with sometimes conflicting ideological goals, be able to work cooperatively? I'd really appreciate your insights in the comments below. That does it for this episode. Be sure to give us a like if you think we've earned it. I'm Darius Spearman. Thank you for watching.